Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in our Chats with Emily, as we are calling our readings through the poetry of Emily Dickinson in the Johnson edition. We turn now to poem 358, If Any Sink, Assure That This Now Standing. It is another survivor poem, we will call it. It is another phoenix poem, a poem about rising. It is another theodicy as well. Our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at LearnStrong.net down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily. I'm hopeful that you've worked with our set of introductory comments where we talk about our big five. What does this poem say about epistemology, what you can know, ontology, who we are, psychology, the study of the individual mind, sociology, the study of the collective mind, and then finally that fifth, theodicy. Why must there be pain and suffering? How is it that we deal with the sorrow and suffering and pain of the world? Emily will say, once you get past the pain and suffering, you're able to ask the correct question, in her view, why did this happen for me? It is another contrast poem as well. It is one of the few of Emily's poems that are written in iambic pentameter as well. We'll point that out. She says it this way: If any sink, assure that this now standing failed like themselves, and conscious that it rose, grew by the fact and not the understanding, how weakness passed or force arose. Tell that the worst is easy in a moment, dread but the whizzing before the ball. When the ball enters, silence, dying, annuls the power to kill. And you can hear it, if any sink, assure that this now standing, ba-bum, 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 that iambic pentameter, right? Which will obviously take us back to our study of Shakespeare's sonnets and any number of other, sonnets that play the game. What exactly is it that she's saying? Notice, if any sink, we're going to get to the shooting with a ball. Think about the time here of 1862 and obviously the terrible war that will be a part of the history of this time period. If any sink, assure is the key word, that this now standing. So note the comparison between sinking and standing. Failed like themselves, right? In other words, I am living proof, is her argument, that you can sink and still stand, right? Failed like themselves, notice capitalized. And conscious, key word, that it rose, grew by the fact, notice capitalized. And not the understanding how weakness passed. In other words, when you go through a really tough, by the way, we don't know what she's referencing here that was tough for her. She survived it. But when you go through it, you find a way to the other side. It passes or goes beyond understanding. You don't always have words for it. It's not always something that you can explain, if you will, translinguistic. How weakness passed or force arose. In other words, when you go through the experience, it's often impossible to explain how it made you stronger. Of course, we think of the Nietzsche dictum, that which does not destroy me makes me stronger. Tell, again, Chats with Emily is why we call our playlist that. Tell that the worst is easy in a moment. Dread, but the whizzing before the ball. Now we're talking about the ball of a firearm, right? Okay, and the whizzing of the bullet, right? The whizzing before the ball. When the ball enters, in other words, your shot, enters silence, right? In other words, we worry about the ball. We think of, obviously, Crane's red badge of courage, don't we here? We've given full comments at LearnStrong. We worry that the ball is going to find us, and then, of course, when it finally does find us, well, then you got to live with whatever happens on the other side. She says it's dying. In other words, metaphorically, going through the process of this pain, the sorrow, losing, annuls the power to kill. That is to say, right, once the worst has happened, well, there's the point at 2a, right? Once the worst has happened, we'll have to deal with it, right? And we get through it. We rise through it. In other words, when bad things happen, we can ask, why did this happen to me? Or we can learn to ask, why did this happen for me? I think this is Emily's theodicy, and I think it's a powerful insight. At 2b, note the tone of assurance here. It is a compelling one. We'll as well at 3a, reference poem 457. Now when we get to this poem, we'll come back one more time to this poem at 457. This is the way she says it. Sweet, safe houses, glad gay houses, sealed so stately tight, lids of steel on lids of marble, locking bare feet out. Brooks of plush in banks of satin, not so softly fall as the laughter and the whisper from the people pearl. No bald death affront their parlors, no Bold sickness come to deface their stately treasures. Anguish in the tomb hum by in muffled coaches, lest they wonder why any for the press of smiling interrupt to die. In other words, going through the process of loss or death, one then can only really fully appreciate what one has gone through. Finally, at 3B, to own a poem like this, fairly self-evident, right? What was a time when you survived, you rose, you got to the other side, and for that, you are thankful. Thank you.